Hello, welcome back to the channel for yet another astronomy vlog. After months of considering different options for telescopes and mounts to put said telescope on, I decided to settle on the Ioptron Gem 45 and a Celestron C9 1/4 Schmidt Cassegrain, both of which I bought used off of Cloudy Nights Classifieds. Unfortunately, weather has been really poor this month, but I've had a few good nights to take it outside. Inspired by other people's images of Jupiter and Mars on cloudy nights, I've been really focusing on my imaging and have been working really hard on simultaneously learning how to best use the imaging software as well as learning how to use the new mount and telescope. So let's talk about the new OTA first, or the optical tube assembly. So unlike other telescopes that I've owned, this is the first telescope that I purchased without a mount with it. And again, we call that the OTA, or the optical tube assembly, because it can be interchangeable to the mount that you have. So this is a Schmidt Cassegrain type telescope, and again, it's 9 1/4 inches aperture, so it's a little bigger than my Dobsonian, but only by 1 1/4 inches. And a Schmidt Cassegrain combines the elements basically of a reflector and a refractor. So it has a primary mirror in the back and a secondary mirror right here, but it also has this corrector plate over it, which kind of serves as like a refractor. So that allows the length of the OTA to be a little shorter than what it would normally have to be otherwise. So to adjust focus, there's a knob here in the back, and this one also came with a Crayford style focuser. It doesn't normally come with one of those, but you can't see it right now, of course. But so it has a focuser that's kind of like the one on my old telescope, but as well there's also a knob that actually moves the primary mirror forward and backward to get focus in the eyepiece. That's the default way to adjust focus on a Schmidt Cassegrain. So there are many pros and cons to this kind of telescope, but basically this is a mid to high power telescope that does a really great job for smaller celestial objects at really high power. So obviously things like planetary imaging, but you can also, it does also a pretty good job of looking at things like planetary nebulas or small galaxies that are far away. All right, so let's talk about the mount. This is the Ioptron Gem 45. GEM, or GEM, stands for German Equatorial Mount, which is a common style of mounts in astronomy. And the 45 stands for the effective payload capacity, which is 45 pounds. So you can put up to 45 pounds that would sit up here on the saddle. So previously I've been mainly using my 8-inch Dobsonian, and the Dobsonian style mount is way simpler to set up, which is a good thing for most things. But sometimes you want something like this, and it's a little more complicated to set up because it has to be aligned with the North Pole. So my 4-inch telescope came with an equatorial mount, but it was not an electronic mount. It was just a standard manual control mount. So I already kind of knew how to get this set up at least, but at $2,500, this is effectively a high-end scientific instrument. So it comes with a lot more features, of course. And getting to use this thing for the first time, even though I knew what it could do when I bought it, but when I first used it, I was like a kid in a candy store. It was like magic. I couldn't believe what I could do with this thing. So really cool piece of equipment. I could probably fill a whole 2 hours on what this mount could do, but I'm going to save you some of the details and just give you some of the basics here. So as I had mentioned previously, this is a tracking mount. So basically, unlike a manual telescope where you're constantly having to move it to keep whatever it is you're looking at in the view, this does that for you, which is great for visual astronomy, but it is nearly a requirement for astrophotography. Not necessarily, but it certainly helps. So you may have seen in my previous videos when imaging the planets, I would put it on the camera and it would just kind of slowly drift across the sensor, and then I'd have to move it back, do it again. This does all that for me, so I don't have to, aside from occasionally, usually it's not perfect, so you have to adjust it every now and then, but this makes shooting the planets and other things way better. By that measure, I can also use what's called region of interest, or ROI. And so what that does is it reduces the size of the camera sensor to allow me to take more frames per second, which is great for planetary imaging. So that's a double win for 2 reasons. So first of all, again, it gives me more frames, which is more data to work with, but also it saves a ton of space as far as the videos are concerned when I'm shooting. So, like I said, it's a double win. That's only scratching the surface of the features of this mount, though. When it comes to astrophotography, there's a lot of other really important features that I haven't really used much yet, including things like auto guiding, periodic error correction, and also even this bipolar alignment scope. There's actually a camera in here that allows you to better align your mount with Polaris. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to use that yet because I can't see Polaris from my observing site, but definitely will be using that when I get a chance to do so. Not to mention, this mount only weighs 17 pounds, and that sounds like a lot, but the other mounts I were considering that also had the same payload capacity were twice as much. So that's like as much as the piano amp that I have down there, and I couldn't even imagine trying to lift that and put that up on top of a tripod in the dark. So really glad I made this purchase so far. It's been a blast to use, and it's great. So I also wanted to talk about the counterweights for the telescope. Now, normally the counterweights are like the least exciting part of a new telescope, but I had to talk about these because my brother, he's a machinist, he offered to make me these counterweights. So these are two 12-pound solid steel, not stainless steel, but solid steel counterweights. And they're unique because they're not, normally when you buy counterweights, they're cast steel, but this is a hardened steel. So it's a little more dense, and therefore the size of these weights is actually a little bit smaller than what they would be otherwise. So that's a pretty nice feature about them. But honestly, they work really well, and they're just unique. They're really cool. Other counterweights would be painted. These are actually clear coated, but you know, they have the steel color, which is really cool. And they're just, like I said, they're really great. They work really well. And like I said, they're unique. So thanks again to my brother for making those. Had to shout him out in this video, of course. So as I said earlier, with the weather being really poor, imaging has been a bit of a bust this month. Even clear nights are average at best. So despite that, I've been determined to use the scope as much as I can, if for the sole purpose of just learning how to use it. There's a really steep learning curve to learning this kind of gear. I can see why a beginner would be totally overwhelmed by trying to use this. On my first night with the C9 1/4, it took me 15 minutes just to find Jupiter because the magnification of this new telescope is just so much higher than I am used to. Luckily, I remembered I had the red dot finder lying around. The 6x30 finder scope it came with, kind of like the one on my 4-inch, it's just completely useless, especially for a telescope of that size. So I will probably be replacing that in the near future. Like I said, despite that, I've been having a blast, and I've been constantly monitoring the weather apps and anxiously waiting for the next clear night for me to be able to get the telescope out. All right, so up in the sky at this time, we pretty much have all the major planets. Saturn is starting to move towards conjunction with the Sun, so it's getting lower and lower in the horizon, but still observable. Mars is at near opposition this month, so appearing extra bright. And Jupiter, Uranus, and Neptune are all pretty viable targets this month as well. Venus and Mercury appear just above the horizon at sunset and will continue to get a little bit higher and higher the next few weeks or so. Coming up in the winter months, however, the exterior planets will begin to move towards conjunction with the Sun. So this means we're coming up on Orion season. So the Great Orion Nebula and many of the other deep sky objects in the Orion constellation will be viable targets in the next few months or so. For me, Mars is behind the trees until a little bit later in the evening, so I'll be waiting a couple weeks to do more imaging on Mars when it's a little bit easier for me to shoot. And then also right now, Jupiter, Uranus, and Neptune are super great targets, so I'll be focusing on those. Saturn is, sadly, I can still see it usually, but it goes down behind the trees pretty quickly, so Saturn season for me is basically over. But so that's what's up in the night sky. Go check out the planets while you still can, and until next time, clear skies.